This afternoon we have with us the wonderful Kimiko Hahn. In my first year in the MFA program at NYU, there were 3 books that everyone seemed to be reading. Though since we were poor, penniless graduate students, and graduate student poets at that, there was probably only 1 copy of each book being passed around. One of the books was The Selected Levis by Larry Levis, one was Louise Gluck's The Wild Iris, and the third was The Artist's Daughter by Kimiko Hahn, which had just come out. Kimiko met with the approval of our not easily impressed teacher, former US Poet Laureate and lovely loudmouth Philip Levine, who on seeing the book at the beginning of class remarked, "Oh, she's good." An unequivocal endorsement from Phil was a big deal. Wallace Stevens had gotten one, Dylan Thomas, but very few living poets passed what we called the Levine test. Terrible, just terrible, was his most common response to the work of his contemporaries. Many of them highly esteemed elsewhere, and many of them as friends. What I think attracted us to Kimiko's work then were the same things that make it exciting to me now. A sense of adventure and eclecticism in terms of subject matter, arising partly out of her use of a Japanese form called zuihitsu, which translates as running brush, and involves the poem maintaining a sense of process, movement, juxtaposition, and collage. A jagged, argumentative relationship to form, and an ability to balance several sources of material at once, many of them unlikely. In Kimiko's work, there's a rejection of that old idea that the only thing a poem can really know is the poet. And in the course of her career, she has written about everything from necrophilia to Asian American identity and women's issues to premature burial. She has taken her inspiration from sources as diverse as Gray's Anatomy, the textbook, not the TV show. Though if there is a poet who could get both those things into the one poem, Kimiko is she. And the pillow book of Sei Shonagan. She's also carried into American verse a series of concepts that just weren't there before. What Kimiko's poems do again and again is try to draw the self out and make sense of that self by putting it into unlikely juxtapositions. In her most recent collection, Brain Fever, a series of carefully interpreted quotes and clippings on dwarf stars spin off towards a moment in which the poet confesses, "My view on dwarf stars involves my mother-in-law, who, before I married her son, described my height as such to dissuade him from marrying me or anyone. No matter that others considered me a kind of star, adjuncting at an ivy." While in another poem, a science description of how unraveling the millions of miles of wires in the human brain would be like untangling a bowl of spaghetti leads the poet to an old photo of her daughter in her high chair, intently picking out each strand of mash in her mouth. In addition to zuihitsu, Kimiko has brought into American verse a series of other techniques and forms from Japanese poetry, often based around notions of poetic play, and pardon my probably incorrect pronunciation here. Engo, which she defines in the essay that ends Brain Fever as word association, Honkadorai, which is elusive variation, and Kaki Toba, a pivot word or rhetorical scheme in which a series of sounds is employed so as to mean 2 or more things at once in different parsings. Often the play is both self-revealing and humorous, as with the poem The Dream of Toast, which leads the speaker to conjure the taste of charcoal, champagne, and a dedicated street murder, all different ways in which the originating noun might be employed, redeployed, put to work, played with. In Kimiko's poems, though, play is by no means engaged solely for play's sake. Rather, this is play with consequences, as in the poem Resilience, where a series of deep, deft descriptions of how a mosquito can fly through a raindrop as much as 50 times its weight become the means to remember a boyfriend whose mother was strangled when he was 7. or the poem Circling the Nest, where the shape of an egg leads the poet to think first of how her own daughters had to be wrenched out, caesarean and forceps respectively, and then of her own birth, of which she knows little, since my mother was innately circuitous. There's a fierce intelligence at work in these pairings, joinings, comminglings, and collages, and out of those pairings we arrive at an understanding that wouldn't otherwise be available to us. In these poems, sculpted, honed, and hard-edged in a craft that prizes a language of disruption, as Kimiko herself has described it, the self is not revealed in isolation, but through its intricate and often unlikely interactions with the wider world. In one poem, an article on the genetic origins of birdsong leads the poet to realize that my husband's multifarious come-ons were hardly scripted on trains where doo-wop was rehearsed, but from patriarchs on the Grand Concourse. While in another she follows 5,000 blackbirds fallen from the sky, not mid-fairy tale, but news at 6, towards that race for causative agents, in case we're next. Did the flock cross coincident fireworks or an exacting god, she wonders? Did they soar into some invisible divide from another dimension, out of the twilight zone, before coming to wonder at and honor our constant human quest for the fabulous? A fabulous connected as it is both to marvels and fables that her work explores again and again in homage to another Japanese artistic concept, sabi, the beauty of irregularity or the unfinished. Kimiko Hahn is the author of 9 books of poetry, including most recently Brain Fever, Toxic Flora, and The Narrow Road to the Interior. Her awards include the Theodore Roethke Memorial Poetry Prize and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. She teaches in the MFA program in Creative Writing and Literary Translation at Queen's College, where she is a distinguished professor. Please give a warm, warm welcome to Kimiko Hahn.
Oh, there are a lot of people here. Guess you waited this long to come to a poetry reading. You saved my poetry reading. Thank you. I hope I will not disappoint. Thank you very much, Karen, for that really lovely and extensive introduction. Sometimes when I'm being introduced, I kind of lapse into a daydream and think, who is that person he's talking about? And then I wake up and I have to come read. So. It's an absolutely beautiful campus. I was walking around a little bit. And of course, too, sorry polar bears, but it's so wonderfully warm. It's just beautiful out. So thank you. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for coming. I'm going to read from my last 2 books, Toxic Flora, and then also Brain Fever. I need to start my little clock here. I like to try taking things from all different sources. And usually my way in, almost like a portal, is to find the language or words that capture me. And then I'll move into that. I was not one of these super smart math and science Asian American students. In fact, I was terrible at all of that. I was sort of, artsy, hippie type person. So that for me, as an adult, reading science was very exotic. It's an exotic language for me, the way someone studying Japanese culture, they might find that exotic for them. Science is totally alien, really. So this was my way into science. It was through the language itself, and I just became very swept up by both the language and then also the kind of stories that came out. I notice that, Karen, you've written a lot on Darwin. So I'm going to start with On Deceit as Survival. Little step back. So most of the poems in Toxic Flora were written after reading articles from the science section in the New York Times. So I would read the article and then I would play around with some rough drafts and try and figure out what the heck my connection was to the material itself. Otherwise, you might as well just read the article. That's going to be far more interesting than anything I have to write about science. So it had to connect to me, and in this poem it was deceit. On Deceit as Survival. Darwin could not believe an insect would visit a blossom that had no reward, and insisted that the green-winged orchid must withhold its nectar deep inside. But he was deceived as well, since this orchid does not offer nectar in its own Darwinian desire to attract, then rid itself of the useful bee. Still other orchids smell like feces or carrion for the sort that prefers to lay eggs in such environs. Yet another orchid species resembles a female bumblebee, ending in frustrated trysts, or appears to be two fractious males, which also attracts, no surprise, a third bee curious enough to join the fray. What to make of highly evolved beauty, bent on deception as survival? Liposuction, rejuvenated clitoris, plumped lips. I plead with daughters to forget about the enhanced buttocks and rely on soap as fragrance. But how can a mother instruct on deceit when girls so readily flaunt thigh and thong, and when parking lots are replete with broken fences and the preternatural buzz of the car alarm? You're all so serious. I'm going to have to really work on you. This has a title from a golden oldie song, Just Walk Away, Renee. The mite harvestman, a daddy longlegs, found in 400 million year old fossils, wandered between several continents without so much as a swim. A conundrum, if it weren't for plate tectonics, a notion only realized in 1911 when a scientist matched up fossils on either side of the Atlantic. I think about this discovery and try to tease out a simile, but really it's better just to leave the first land animals alone, the shifting and colliding and breaking apart alone, the drifting, the sadness that marks the opening of a quest, only to discover estrangement. We're still in the insect section, okay. Yellow jackets protect through venom and candor, while timing their own dinners to mother's tray, father's tongs, or baby's saucer-sized cheeks. They can sting any intruder repeatedly, unlike the honeybee's suicidal sortie. I like that. I like X, who calls people out at brunch through simple narration. Your mouth never stops moving. Or, you eat off other plates as if they're your own. Or, you check your BlackBerry when no one is talking about you. Or, you laugh whenever you insult someone. a startling attribute I wish I could emulate, if only my sting possessed such integrity. So, when I was putting together Toxic Flora, I had several very long zuihitsu, and in this case they looked like collages. They look like long prose sections. And my editor had loved those in previous collections, so I felt very confident. Gave it to her. She did what she usually does. She gave me the manuscript right back to work on harder. She's a toughie. And she suggested that I take out these zuihitsu, which really kind of upset me. But she said, why don't you choose one of them and just take sections, just some paragraphs here and there, and kind of flip them through the whole manuscript. She felt that the shorter poems, these like little lyric poems that I've just read, she felt that they were kind of weighed down by these longer pieces. So I looked at the various zuihitsu I had, and I chose the one on sexual cannibalism. Wouldn't you? So here are little bits from that zuihitsu that I saved. Nowadays, when friends read about Darwin and something like sexual cannibalism, they immediately expect a poem. Then there's my own jealousy of the material itself, that someone will get to it first. Whatever the pressure, that the female mantis devours the head of the still mating male and then moves on to the rest of his body, is a shocking bit of information. Because I am past childbearing years? Because I have daughters? Or because it just seems vulgar to eat in bed? Thank you. Here's another short bit that I saved. Was the coitable cannibalism shocking because I'd thought it only occurred in captivity? Nevertheless, as my father-in-law used to say, the photographer commented, "It kind of got boring." Then she reached around, grabbed him around the neck, and bit his face off. Science Times, so great. Wonderful material. Awareness. Among the burrowing owls, scraps of carpet and tinfoil, tucked into the humid straw, the hoard of cow dung is especially prized, as it attracts dung beetles. The owls watch for hours, revealing a tool of attraction of which those clever creatures may not be aware. What then is awareness? Connecting shit to consequence. The flicker that links, say, chlorine to climax, or who consumed whom at faculty picnics. I'll read a longer piece that actually is not based on, not completely based on the Science Times. So, it's called Demeter's Cuttings, and Demeter, of course, is the goddess, the Greek goddess of harvest and fertility, and you may or may not need to be reminded that her daughter Persephone was kidnapped by the king of hell, Hades, and she wanted to obviously rescue her daughter. The deal that was struck was that she could have her daughter once a year, And during that time, that became summer and spring. Demeter's cuttings. My own mother taught me suspicion, to question a man's gifts, whether trifles or truffles. She also taught me the names of trees and how to rub off the dried sheaths of silver dollar stalks, toss the seeds back over the bed. She didn't teach me much else, and truthfully, I like nature, not to tend but visit, to watch it take care of itself. Still, a fistful of snapdragons, a flock of yellow dragonflies, a cluster of cicada nymphs. This is what I wish to entice my daughter back to, what I love to what I love. While below, the subway quakes the whole building. Once she called to tell me, "Mother, don't make me choose." A young man had taken her into the subway to his parents' home for dinner, and by curfew she called to say there were no cabs in sight. I said, "But you're too young to stay with him." And I imagined him standing over her as she covered the receiver, saying, "My mother won't let me stay." Where was the father? Teaching his new wife's son to piss in a pot? What I've learned about men is that they bludgeon to make a point, that he will not shut up until his woman weeps and folds in on herself, blames herself for his empty hands. Then he can dismiss her or hold her, as if rescuing her from himself. This is what I learn daily to walk away from. Shut up. You're wrong. Who cares? And now, in my own apartment, I wait past her curfew to doze or leaf through people, self, us. Listen to restaurant crowds dispersing, the drunks heaving below my window. Wait up to hear a car door. I know that first boy takes a turbulent daughter to keep her in the dark, but still I wait for keys at the door. Was she so bored in these rooms cluttered with scarves and cosmetics, a few African violets? And isn't that all right, to be a child and be bored? My own childhood was a doll that could do nothing but close her eyes, games with nothing but dice and men, a tape recorder to record what? That boredom? Then there were records of myths and Peter Pan, the marsh across the street, cattails, Jack in the pulpits, and trees so high you couldn't climb them, or if you did, the jays would peck your head to protect their squawky nests. Then there was the odd heron, then there was her father. Before she met this young man, I asked, "Do you miss me when we're apart?" And she answered, "I miss myself, Mommy." These days, she claims, I'll do what I want. In spite of the blue porcelain cups, the kitty cat clock hung on the wall, its tail ticking, there comes a point where the mother must risk losing her daughter by telling her, "No, you must leave him tonight." My own sisters tell me she'll come home, and when she does, the morning glory vine on the construction fencing across the street will open its pink lyric. Then we'll toast bread and perk coffee and arrange the asphodel on the yellow table. Or will she regard the welt on her arm as an exotic flower from that other world? I cannot say. Sedna. Come to find out, Sedna is the Inuit woman whose father cast her from their kayak thus transforming her into the spirit of the sea, but also the name of 2003 VB12, a planet or something beyond Pluto. It is the first body to be discovered in the Oort cloud, a hypothetical region of icy objects that become comets. But questions remain. How can a region be hypothetical? How can a scientist not know what a planet is? How could a father throw his daughter from a kayak even if she did write poetry that hurt his feelings? I am not sorry. He always said, art comes first, but that is a murky region for fathers and daughters, what comes first. And what my daughters wish to know is, did she drown for his sake, or to learn how depths betray? I thought I was finished with science after Toxic Flora was published, but when you tell yourself you're finished with something, sometimes you stop writing because it's not finished with you. So I gave myself assignments, just keep the engine going, and I went back to the New York Times, but this time I went to only articles, or almost exclusively articles, on neuroscience, which I knew nothing about then, and I still don't know anything about. But I decided to take one article and write just a bunch of poems, and I gave myself little assignments, little formal assignments. Repeat words, take one word like the word toast and see how far I could go. So I'm going to read some poems from Brain Fever. And this is from, let's see, a dream sequence. That was triggered by an article on dream theory, or dreams in the brain. Oops. The dream of a little occupied Japan doll. It's my little occupied Japan doll. Among the 100 porcelain figurines, the first one, with slanted eyes, fat cheeks, Q, though that's Chinese, and Chinese bonnet, is my favorite. Among all those in pajamas or gowns, or the two in kimono, the first is my favorite. Of those with rickshaw, tambourine, or parasol and fan, I keep on my desk the first one, though she or he is not doing a darn thing. Here in sleep, rivalry is reserved. And as dreams tune the mind for conscious awareness, perhaps this favoritism suggests I've quit hoarding and now collect myself. The dream of knife, fork, and spoon. I can't recall where to set the knife and spoon. I can't recall which side to place the napkin, or which bread plate belongs to me, or how to engage in benign chatter. I can't recall when more than one fork, which to use first, or what to make of a bowl of water. I can't see the place cards or recall any names. The humiliation is impressive, the scorn. No matter how much my brain revises the dinner to see if the host was a family member, I can't recall which dish ran away with which spoon. One problem with writing using outside source material is that it took me much longer to revise my poems than usual because I really held on to the really interesting stuff and I needed to trim out more and more. And I wouldn't until my friends would tell me, you've got to take that stuff out. It doesn't belong. So I have good friends. Otherwise, each of these poems are, well, they wouldn't be in the book, but they'd be twice as long. The Dream of a Raindrop. Whether tear or rain, neither appear round on search engine images, even though scientifically speaking, the latter begins as a liquid globe, aggregates of water molecules that have condensed around specks of dust or salt, until gravity has its way and circle turns into chandelier crystal. Drizzle, downpour, tempest. Come inside, Kimmy, before you catch your death. This from the Brain and the Unconscious. And here I have, in some of these epigraphs, I should say here, though, with Toxic Flora, I was reading some poems at a poetry reading before the book came out, and talking about the Science Times and how much I love those articles, blah, 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 just the way I have here. And a young man came up to me after the reading and said that he was one of the editors at the Science Times. And when the book comes out, would I like to go to one of the staff meetings and meet the writers? And I thought, oh, right? I mean, they're like world-class science writers. I just couldn't believe the invitation. So I took him up on the offer. When the book came out, I notified him, and as I stepped up the subway stairs on, I guess it's 40th Street, to go to the New York Times building, I completely broke out in a cold sweat. I thought, what are you doing? You just stole all these people's material, and you had your way with the material, and now you're going to read poems to them. But shameless person that I am, I walked right into the staff meeting Tuesday afternoons, and I introduced myself. I read a few poems, and I said that this is for Toxic Flora, I said, in every poem, with every article, I note in the back which article I've used. So I was really happy when the book was passed around that they all were looking in the back to see if I used their work. So that made me feel better. And no one threw any staplers or anything at me. In this case, I use a lot of material by the writer Benedict Carey. And again, I like to use, and this comes from Japanese aesthetics, I like to use words that have multiple meanings. So, vanity, right? It's a dresser, but it's also to be vain, right? Brooch, it's a piece of jewelry, or to broach a topic, right? Spelled differently. Loafers, loafing, trench coat, or to be in a trench. Profile, alarm, forecast, fidelity, right? All those words, you can really work them hard, and they draw you into a kind of different space, which poetry should do. Excuse me. Alarm. Quote, before doctors learn how it is that the brain's lights turn on, they may have to know a lot more about what's happening when the lights are off. Benedict Carey. In her dark, she surveys empty. The vanity from the in-laws' Bronx apartment, the brooch from a lover, loafers by a coat tree, trench coat, the husband's profile, an alarm for news and forecast. Here she appraises fidelity before the light violates. Oh, another Demeter poem, Demeter? Demeter? Demeter?
I say Demeter.
Demeter. Keep going back and forth. Porch light. Barley, poppy, then a pomegranate. Now front porch light. There's no longer sensation without the one, once cradled in tissue, swaddled in blood, feeling her hiccup inside the inside. Turn the pages of a calendar to retrieve one's daughter from his underground vow. I must unlock the door, leave it ajar, since by degrees the son-in-law rations my weather. I'll read the spaghetti poem that Karen referred to. A bowl of spaghetti. Excuse me. To find a connectome, or the mental makeup of a person, researchers experimented with the neurons of a worm, then upgraded to mouse, hoping to unravel the millions of miles of wires in the human brain that they likened to untangling a bowl of spaghetti, of which I have an old photo. Ray in her high chair, intently picking out each strand to mash in her mouth. Was she too? Was that sailor dress from Mother? Did I cook that sauce from scratch? If so, there was a carrot in the pot, as Mother instructed, and I'll never forget, no matter which strand determines ardor as a daughter's verdict. Excuse me. Cherry stems. I'm not too happy that fruit flies have brains, since I swat them whenever I see them or think I see them. I know about their brains because I met a scientist who tinkers with their learning circuitry, the actual mechanics of how a memory trace is laid down in a nerve cell or neuron. All this proxy, dissecting the behavior of an insect to figure out how the brain works for something like typing, at which my mother was a pro and me fairly miserable because of some disorder, which it seems my daughter has inherited since she also exhibits left-right confusion. However, she can twist a cherry stem into a bow with her tongue, an ability no doubt from an ancestral brain, but which also reveals something about a summer in Florence. In other words, too much information regarding memory trace. That's usually my last one. Go back and end with this one from Toxic Flora. Cope's rule. According to Edward Drinker Cope, 19th century paleontologist, fossil records show lineages become larger over millennia, indicating that bigger is more successful. Though later scientists offered further support for Cope's rule, from mammals to corals, paleontologists in the last century challenged such evidence. Gould, in particular, was dismissive of such a psychological artifact. Current, more rigorous studies suggest the results are plain to see. Being big provides a big advantage. And yet, the study continues, why isn't Cope's rule more of a rule? Laws of physics reveal that insects cannot grow to the size of Tyrannosaurus rex because their exoskeleton cannot support heavy loads of body mass. Furthermore, a small rat is probably better adapted to a certain niche. There is also the issue of surviving mass extinction, though not everything can get small enough, quick enough. I am small already, so that isn't a personal concern. Still, each consecutive husband has gotten larger, though I'm not sure why or what that reveals, except it's easier for Harold to reach for stuff on the top shelf rather than watch me at 50, well, this was a while ago, at 50, climb on the kitchen counter, though last weekend he bought for us both a step ladder, ruling out vulgar advantage. Thank you. I thought I would entertain questions or comments.
Yes. The professors always have to sort of break the ice. So, once you got the ideas from the Science Times, did you, because I mean, I've read those articles too, and then if you read them online, there are also links and so forth. Did you feel compelled to go beyond that? Or was that going to be, well, I think about the poem that you read with too much information. I mean, was that going to be too much information? How far did you let your research go? Where did it stop as you were writing those poems?
Well, I actually started with an actual, what's called a clipping morgue in journalism schools and libraries, where you actually clip the article. So I had piles of articles, and I'd take them to Bagel Cafe, and I'd write, and I'd fuss. And but since then, I've been clipping them online and saving them in a doc. And what I try and do is not get, I cut and paste the article, or just save it as a doc. So I don't get tempted to go beyond that. So it's pretty contained. With the neuroscience, that's when I allowed myself to go crazy and kind of just, well, there's the dream theory, there's consciousness, there's circles in the brain, and the teenage brain, teenage brain. So I really tried to have fun with it that way. Yeah, thank you.
Did you find that, like, from reading the Science Times, like, over and over again, that you came up with, like, favorite authors or people that you kept pulling the same authors' like, work?
Yeah, well, especially Benedict Carey writes on the brain, so a lot of his work shows up in my last book. Yeah, but I try to really, well, you know, sometimes the really, really short articles, the ones that are just a few paragraphs long, they're in a section called something like The Observer or something like that. They're really, really useful because it's so contained that if I just get, you know, get captivated by one or two words, I'm off. So Henry Fountain actually was doing a lot of writing for that. Now there's someone else, but yeah. Yeah.
You talked about having to cut down a lot of your poems. Could you talk about like your revising process?
Mm-hmm. Well, for these, what I try and do both for myself and also with my advanced writing students and graduate students is to try and see where the poem is going. This is a long answer to a short question, sorry. So, for example, the first one, Deceit, Deceit as Survival. Well, that was what the article was about, but it also became what my own theme in the poem itself. So I try and see when I have raw material and do a lot of writing, whether I'm using outside source material or I'm just writing something that is a little more autobiographical, say. I try and see where the poem is going, what the themes are in the poem, and then go with that, and then trim back to that. And with the poems in Toxic Flora, I really had to trim back. Otherwise, it really was just a kind of retelling of the article in poetic form. And no one needs that. They just read the wonderful articles themselves, so, which are so gorgeously written. Yeah. So it's seeing where the poem is going and then trimming back to the poem, rather than what I think the poem is about. Does that sort of make sense? Yeah, because I'm not the kind of person who has to have an idea of what to write, which is one reason I love triggers and outside material. I'll read and then I'll write. You know, it's just constant triggers and constant assignments to myself, really. Whether it's necrophilia, sorry I didn't bring that poem, or premature burial, which is really fun to write about. For that, I saw a movie called Wisconsin Death Trip, which is also a book of photographs. And as my husband and I were leaving the movie theater, I said, wow, there was that instance of premature burial that someone was relating. I should write about that. And he said, oh, I have just the book for you at home. So that's the kind of guy he is. So he writes about death and serial killers and whatnot. So in fact, he had a book called, from the 1800s, called Premature Burial and How to Prevent It. So great. Oh my God, it's the best book. So, you know, I'm a little magpie. I just, whatever catches my eye. So not always science, yeah.
When it comes to the triggers and topics that you write about, were you always interested in them, like neuroscience, for example, which trickled into your poetry, or was it the other way around?
I've always liked to use outside source material, and I consider it my material. So whether it's about a cup, or whether it's about something happening in the news, or whether it's about, you know, one of my daughters, that's all my life. You know, if something's happening in the news, that's my life too. I've written about black lung disease. I did some interviewing of coal miners, and I wrote some poems because that became something that I was interested in. So whatever I'm interested in, that's potential subject matter. And then where I come in are the themes. Because if I don't connect to it, then the poem just remains a good idea. So I try and really figure that out. As I was saying, see where the poem's going, see what the themes are. Yeah. Thank you.
Between the oral versus written tradition, which one do you like? Is there one that you see yourself connecting more with poetry, or how does that affect you with writing your poetry?
Well, I'm very much an on-the-page person, but I have to read my poems aloud in order to hear it. So I guess I'd say I'm a little bookish, but I'm also kind of a ham. So I because I really like the sound of words. That's part of what captivates me. And in Brain Fever especially, I have a lot of slant rhyme, actually. Very irregular, but I want to work on the listener's, the reader's ear to kind of seduce them into the poem. And you can do that especially with slant rhyme, and especially if you're not really sure what's going on, but you think someone's flirting with you. It's the poem that's flirting with you. It's the slant rhyme that's beginning to work work on you. So I'm very much on the page, but it has to work in the ear. So yes.
Any more questions? We can take one more? Or not? We can just give an extra long round of applause.